Appomattox Court House, April 9, 1865. The sun had a dry, iron taste as it fell behind low hills. Dust rose in slow curtains off the road. A house of pale clapboard sat at a bend, gutters full of the must of late winter, and a small garden of chopped herbs that had gone to seed. The air smelled of tobacco and boiled stew, and the copper tang of sweat on linen. In the doorway stood Clara Hartwell. She was 28 years old. A silver locket hung from a thin chain at her throat, its hinge dulled by years of fingers turning it open and closed. Her hands smelled faintly of lavender and soap. Her dress had a tear at the sleeve cuff, a darkened smudge of soot beside it. She was the wife of Captain John Mercer, who had ridden away with the regiment one spring and returned with his uniform in tatters and his jaw shut against the world. 3 Union officers were across the lane, their boots sinking into packed earth while they wrote names into a ledger. They spoke in clipped sentences and moved with the authority of men who had been taught to reduce people into rows of words. A clerk held up a list and pointed, and one of the officers tapped his pen. Their faces were already forgetting the shape of mercy. This is not merely a domestic scene following a battle. This is where laws, bodies, and paperwork collided and made new definitions of ownership and custody. What happened to Clara in the days after the surrender would be explained in curt lines across memos and in a sealed testimony filed under a rubric that read Custody and Confiscation. Officially, the entry lasted 2 sentences. Unofficially, there are letters, a torn pocket Bible, a registry note, and a draft memorandum bearing a redaction that no archivist wanted to speak of for a century. You know the broad arc of April 1865. You know of surrenders and paroles, of generals shaking hands on porches. You do not know what became of a woman whose name appears in a ledger as property of the regiment, nor how directives meant to manage supplies and spoils were bent or rewritten to subsume a civilian life. Today I will walk you through depositions, memoranda, and a salvage of letters that were hidden in a donor file until 1989. I will read portions of testimony that were recorded under oath and later expunged, and I will show how an administrative clause about confiscation and demobilization was used to authorize custodial transfer of a person. Let me take you back 3 months, to a winter when Clara still kept the bakery ledger and the small garden, and believed that paper could protect her family. Clara Hartwell was born in a town of low chimneys and river mist, the 4th child of a cooper and a seamstress. Her childhood smelled of wet wood shavings and bread baking on the Vore hearth. As a girl, she learned to sew in a narrow warmth lit by candle, to count change by feeling coins on the pads of her fingers, and to read aloud from hymn books until her voice felt like a rope taut between lines of print. At 17, she married William Hartwell, a man who taught her the geometry of barrels and the cadence of ledger columns. She kept his accounts with a neat, even hand. By 22, she had been widowed when a fever took William and left Clara with 2 small sons and a house that needed constant care. She learned to mend sails and to barter flour for nails. At 25, she met John Mercer at a church picnic. He was polite, precise, and carried a small leather-bound volume of law. He spoke of honor and rank and a future where lines on a page could be made to mean safety. They married in the fall with a borrowed cake and the town minister presiding. Clara learned to read the uniforms that came through her doorway. Her life moved between jars on a shelf, the steady clinking of spoons, ledger pages, and a locket that contained 3 faded silhouettes she had traced one evening for a child who could not sleep. She believed that record-keeping could protect memory, and that an entry in a ledger could keep wrongs from being forgotten. She kept a small red notebook where she wrote purchases, births of neighbors' children, and the names of men who came to town and never left. When John enlisted, Clara wrote his rank and serial into the notebook and underlined the date with a razor edge of hope. That habit of counting and recording would later be the one thing that made her persist in seeking justice, and it would be the same habit that the military bureaucracy would later twist into a rationale for her removal from her home. The man who most often stands across from Clara in the records is Captain John Mercer. He was an officer of discipline and private fragility. Born to a middling attorney, he had been raised to prefer the clarity of rules. As an antagonist in this narrative, he is not a single villain, but rather the living conduit of an institutional logic. He believed in duty and in the sanctity of order. He wrestled with grief the way some men would wrestle with a ledger, by categorizing, filing, and sometimes by writing excuses on the backs of envelopes. After 3 campaigns, he returned changed. His face was pitted and his hands bore thin white scars. He moved through rooms like a man trying to fit back into a suit he had outgrown. There were days when he loved Clara with the sharpness of a ledger entry, and there were nights when his silence widened into a chasm. To the institutional press of his superiors, he was a reliable signatory. To Clara, he was complex, capable, fallible. Over the course of this story, his choices will be read alongside the choices of dozens of staff officers and clerks who archived a version of events intended to protect a chain of command rather than a woman. In the weeks before the surrender, rumors moved through the valley like weather. Men from neighboring farms carried word of troop movements. Abigail Morgan, who lived 2 houses down and kept bees, came to Clara with news of wagons crossing the ford, the clatter of harnesses, and the smell of boiled coffee that always signaled an encampment. Sergeant Thomas Hale, who had once been a blacksmith, stopped at the Hartwell door and left a worn handkerchief on the stoop. Reverend Samuel Boyd told the women in the pews that the ministers were packing their Bibles and that they should prepare for visitors who would not leave with salutes. Clara listened and counted and wrote names into the red notebook. She spoke with Lieutenant Amos Reed under the eaves of a stable, and he offered small, practical advice about what to burn and what to bury. Their conversations were short and practical at first, and gradually became longer, as if the fabric of daily life were stretching thinner by the hour. In these preparatory scenes, there were lengthy exchanges about safety, about whether it was wiser to stay with possessions or to take a child and flee, about whom to trust among the officers who had been quartered in town. The air tasted of rain promised but not yet fallen. The soil stuck to boots in a gray smear, and the light was thin and patient. Clara handled loaves of bread with a tactile deliberateness, smelling wheat and yeast as if those simple scents could anchor her. A week before Lee met Grant, the local administration issued a memorandum that, in formal language, addressed the disposition of supplies and the processing of prisoners and the demobilization of regiments. The memorandum used words like property and confiscation and provided a list of categories for items to be inventoried. It made no mention of civilians, but the language contained loopholes. One paragraph allowed for the seizure of anything that could be classified as resource or contraband. Another clause instructed that unaccompanied dependents be transferred to custodial care pending disposition. In practice, those administrative phrases would be read expansively. A clerk named Daniel Pike altered a column entry one night and wrote a notation that would later be referenced as an authorization. There is an entire procedural paragraph in the files explaining how the clerks were to prepare lists, confirm signatures, and process custodial transfers. The protocol called for 2 officers to sign an inventory, a sergeant to witness the transfer, and a record to be filed with the tribunal's headquarters within 72 hours. Packets were to be stamped, dated, and forwarded to the Office of Parole. Any deviation required a memorandum with cause. Those lines of procedure, written in precise, formal language, became the instruments that allowed a person to be made into an entry. On the day the surrender was announced, there was a scene at the Hartwell gate that plays like a keyed sequence in the records. Clara stood on the path, the locket warm against her breast, as Captain Mercer walked forward with a ledger clutched under his arm. Lieutenant Reed and Sergeant Hale arranged themselves on the road. The Union officers across the lane asked for lists of horses, spices, and men eligible for parole. A clerk named Jonathan Bell unfolded a folded sheet and read names aloud. There was a line for property and a line for dependents. When Clara spoke up because one of her sons had been taken ill and a neighbor needed someone to watch the bakery, the officer who had been filling the ledger looked up and said, "We will record all dependents as transferred to regimental custodial care pending review." Clara heard the phrase as if it were a sentence about flour. Captain Mercer did not look at her at first. When he did, his face was a mask of an officer in command and of a husband unsure of his own compass. Their exchange that day became the heart of the official entry. There are at least 12 recorded verbal exchanges in the testimony that survive from that interaction. Clara asks, "Is this temporary?" And the officer replies, "Pending disposition." She asks, "Who decides?" And Captain Mercer answers, "Headquarters." She asks, "Can I stay?" And the officer says, "It is not customary." She asks, "Will my sons be safe?" And Sergeant Hale murmurs, "We will note the complaint." She offers bread, and it is refused. She reaches for the ledger and is gently but firmly pushed back by an officer whose gloves have grease at the fingers. They speak with a mixture of formal and private tones, often repeating the same facts as if the repetition could salvage clarity. The air is thick with sweat and the metallic scent of ink. The ledger page bears the word custody beside Clara's name. The word is small and final. The scene expands into a longer dialogue reconstructed from depositions. "You understand what the clause means?" said Captain Mercer. "I do not," answered Clara. "It means you will be listed as dependents to be conveyed to the regiment until headquarters determines disposition," said the officer named Bell. "And if we refuse?" Clara asked. "There is no legal guarantee for refusal," said Lieutenant Reed. "We are not thieves," she said. "You are under military process," said Sergeant Hale. "Who will write my name?" she asked. "The clerk will record it," the officer replied. "Will I get to keep my locket?" she asked, touching the metal. "Personal effects documented as such will remain," said Bell, but then he looked away. "Who will watch my boys?" she asked, and several faces hardened. The record shows this exchange in a shorthand, whose omissions later became the locus of omnibus. Dispute. The sensory details crowd the scene: the rasp of paper, the heat of sunlight on the ledger, the clacking of horse tack, the thin sound of a child weeping in the background, the taste of iron on Clara's tongue as she said the name of her eldest. This was the moment the administrative language collided with a human voice and was translated into a formal custody note. Once the ledger entry was made, Clara found herself in a custodial arrangement that had the trappings of order but the cruelty of indifference. She was issued a small token, a strip of stamped cloth with a number sewn into it. She was transferred for processing to a makeshift quarter at a barn, where the smell was a dense soup of animals and damp straw. There she met several other women and children, including Mrs. Lydia Price, who had been a schoolmistress, and a young girl named Eliza Carter, who had the cough, a cough that rattled like beads. The daily routine was catalogued in a report authored by an officer assigned to the log. The report reads of roll calls, of inventories taken each morning, of meals served in kettles, of the obligation for women to work preparing bandages and heating water for boilers. It details the way the clerks handed out rations and how women were called to mend uniforms. It notes the hours spent standing in line to have names verified and the frequent interrupts by mounted officers requiring immediate counts. In one passage, a woman described the tactile sensation of pulling coarse cloth through her fingers while a child slept on her feet, and the taste of stale cornmeal. The custodial life was a series of small humiliations recorded as protocol. Dialogues between women there were shorter, sometimes comforting, sometimes sharp. "Keep the locket safe," Lydia advised. "When will I see John?" Clara asked. "When papers move," said another, her voice small. The sensory record in these routines is dense: the metallic ring of tin cups, the oily smoke that stained the rafters, the roughness of straw in bedding, the cold trickle of water from a trough, the sweetness of a single stolen plum. At least 3 moments of tension in this middle period stand out, and each must be described at length. The first is when the ledger goes missing during a night of rain. For nearly 600 characters, the scene narrows. The sky was low, and the rain was a slow needle through the thatch. The clerk's lamp had been left unattended, and when Jonathan Bell discovered the ledger gone, he accused a woman who had been seen near the table. Clara felt the accusation like a blow. Her palms went slick. She smelled the lanolin of Bellows and felt the roughness of the rough board beneath her knees as she insisted on an accounting. The room tightened around the ledger's absence. It was not only the loss of a book, but the loss of the proof that she and her sons had been recorded. That night, Clara lay awake, tasting the damp wood and the iron edge of fear. The second intense moment happens when a visiting adjutant arrives and begins interviews. The adjutant's office was a long tent that smelled of wax and damp wool. He asked blunt questions, his voice a flat blade. "Did anyone take papers?" he said. "Were goods misappropriated?" he repeated. The women answered, breath shallow. Clara gave testimony in which she described the last night at home, the smell of candles, the clout of boots on the path, and the sound of a rifle shot in the distance. Each detail she gave was taken down in shorthand and later redacted. The adjutant's notebook would later show an entry with a name and then a single line, sealed. This moment of interrogation compressed Clara's life into a set of facts, and the moral texture of her claims was threatened by omissions. Her voice felt cramped like clothing fresh from a chest. The third intense moment is the arrival of a memorandum that officially sealed certain documents and moved them to a central archive. The order came wrapped in official indifference. It was stamped, sealed, and confidential. The archivist Miriam Cole would later describe the sound of the stamp as a knell. That document would be key to this story, because it both authorized the transfer and created the legal cover that allowed a custodial designation to survive scrutiny. For 500 to 600 characters, this moment must be described as an act that translated living suffering into stored paper. The air tasted of dust and glue. Pens rattled. A clerk sighed. The archive would become a place of silence and of decisions that would outlast people. Procedural description in the investigation later provides clarity about how the tribunal reviewed custodial matters. The tribunal convened under a formal schedule. Submissions required an inventory attached to an affidavit. Each claim underwent an initial review by a clerk, then a hearing before a panel composed of 2 officers and a legal advisor. Witness testimony was taken under oath. The panel had the power to confirm custodial transfer for a period of demobilization or to order parole and release. Requests for redaction or sealing passed through a separate memorandum office and were logged in a registry. Appeals required a certified motion within 10 days. That procedural chain explains why certain files were sealed and why the redaction of details became institutional practice. As weeks turned into months, the rhythm of custodial life hardened into routine. Clara learned small economies of movement. She kept her locket in a pocket inside the hem of her dress and would take it out under the table at night to touch its cool oval as she listened to the breathing of children and the creak of the rafters. There were conversations that were halting and others that flowed like slow currents. In one scene, a secondary, "Do they know how to read the ledger?" Lydia asked. "They do enough," Eliza said. "Will they ever announce a release?" Clara asked. "They promised," said Mrs. Price. "Promises are paper thin," said another voice. "We have names, though," Clara said. "Names mean something," answered Lydia. "We will keep ours safe," Eliza promised. Those conversations show attempts to maintain agency through speech even as documentation did the opposite. The crisis that elevates the story is not a single battle, but an institutional unraveling. A rumor spread that certain dependents were to be transferred to a regional depot farther south. That destination was a fortified camp with strict oversight. The transfer order came late at night. Men arrived with wagons whose axles smelled of hot iron. The women were told to pack what they could carry. Some packed letters, and a few kept loaves. Clara tied 3 loaves with a strip of cloth. The order to move was brusque, and the air tasted of horse sweat and old bread. As they marched to the wagons, a contingent of soldiers loyal to a rival officer attempted to stop the convoy for inspection. Voices rose, someone pushed, a child cried. At that instant, the political and personal fused. Captain Mercer, meanwhile, faced a choice. He could sign a supplemental order that would place Clara under his immediate house arrest rather than authorize transport. He hesitated. In the narrative, that hesitation is a moral hinge. The decision he made would determine whether Clara remained within reach of any legal redress or whether she would be moved out of the county into a custody bureaucracy that erased local witnesses. In a sequence of 800 characters that slows to the point of near stasis, we see Captain Mercer looking at his ledger, the weight of ink on the page like a physical pressure on his chest. He is not cruel by design, but is compelled by a chain of command and an appetite for neatness. He signs. The paper is stamped, and the convoy resumes. There is a prolonged exchange during the transfer scene composed of 12 direct verbal turns that must be presented fully because it is the fulcrum of the event central. "Where are they taking us?" asked Clara as wagons creaked. "To the depot for processing," replied an officer. "Do they have our names?" she asked. "On the manifest," said the clerk. "Who decides that?" she asked. "Headquarters issues the route," said a soldier. "Will I see John?" she asked, bending toward Captain Mercer. "I will arrange for information," he said. "Arrange how?" she said. "By forwarding requests," he said. "Who will say if my boys remain with me?" she asked. "That is a question for the panel," said an officer. "Will they leave me behind?" she asked in a small voice. "Not unless you cause disturbance," said the officer. "Is taking our locket permitted?" she asked, holding it to him. "Personal effects?" he said. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I am sure of the record," he said. "If the record errs," she whispered. "Then you will have to appeal," he said. The light narrowed, and the sound of a strap broke like a small gunshot. The exchange carries the rhythm of bureaucracy refusing to be human. Once moved, Clara encountered the depot bureaucracy in full. The depot was an organized place that smelled of wax and salted meat. Rows of tents were aligned like pages in a book. There the women were divided into work groups and assigned chores like laundry, mending, and preparing bandages. The depot kept daily logs of movements and a register that recorded names, ages, and the reason for transfer. The register was a living object that would later become key evidence. Archivist Miriam Cole, who would discover parts of that register years later, described the physicality of the pages, the way ink bled through, and how someone had tried to obliterate a notation with sand. The depot was also a place where friendships formed and where memory was kept alive through small acts of resistance. Women sewed notes into hems, hid letters inside bread, and whispered names to be carried forward. Clara wrote secret entries in her little red notebook, a private archive within a public register. She traded a piece of cloth for a scrap of paper containing an address and the name of a possible witness who had seen the ledger before it was taken. Tension rises again when a scandal erupts over missing personal items. The depot received a complaint from several dependents that personal property had been misappropriated during transfer. The matter was referred to a tribunal. This tribunal was an ad hoc body created to adjudicate small claims arising from the demobilization process. The way the tribunal operated is described in a procedural note that is itself a record of bureaucratic care. It required a plaintiff to produce an inventory, to appear before the panel, to present testimony and witnesses, and to submit any physical evidence. The defense could call for testimony from clerks who had prepared manifests. Hearings were to be recorded in triplicate and copies forwarded to the Office of Demobilization. Despite this procedure, the tribunal proceedings often favored expediency over comprehensive investigations. In Clara's hearing, she found herself facing a legal vocabulary meant to flatten her narrative into a list. When she tried to say the ledger had been removed before her name was properly noted, the presiding officer asked for proof. She had only her red notebook, a voice, and the memory of an eyewitness who had gone missing. The hearing stretched with dense exchanges and at least 5 moments of near collapse where Clara felt the panel leaning toward a procedural closure that would exclude complexity. One of the most dramatic moments came when a clerk, Daniel Pike, confessed years later in a sealed deposition that he had been ordered to alter a column on the manifest. He described a particular night when the ledger was refiled and a line was added that placed certain dependents under regimental ownership pending a tribunal decision. His testimony, recorded decades after the fact, included the smell of the oil lamp under which he worked, the roughness of the paper, and the sound of the stamp hitting the page. This confession appears in a memorandum that would be redacted in part, leaving only the skeleton of truth in black ink and blanked spaces. The power of that entrance is not just the content, but the manner in which institutional redaction creates its own narrative by erasure. The suppression of documents is a recurring theme in Clara's story. Several crucial notes were sealed, including a page from Captain Mercer's pocketbook, noting a directive to register dependents, and a memorandum from a higher office that instructed clerks to expedite disposition. Those documents moved into an archive described as sealed and confidential and transferred to the custody of the department's records officer. Such an archive was, for decades, the place where inconvenient facts went to sleep. The archivist Miriam Cole found boxes stamped sealed in 1890 and then reclassified. The chain of custody of these boxes was sometimes fuzzy and sometimes deliberately obscured. Donors later placed private papers in the National Repository under disclaimers that allowed for delayed release. That strategy of sealing and redaction is central to how the institutional story survived scrutiny for a generation. There is a moral dimension to this suppression. It is not merely the act of hiding, it is the creation of silence that shapes public memory. In the archive, small fragments remained. A torn pocket Bible contained a notation in a shaky hand. September 14, entries listed and checked. A scrap of a letter found in a donor trunk described how Captain Mercer wrote to a superior suggesting that some dependents be kept for work details to support the men. That phrasing was later cited as evidence of a utilitarian logic. Over time, the public record would be assembled into a narrative that made military necessity the central character. Yet, buried documents reveal how decisions about individuals were often made in informal conversations over liquor and by clerks tired at night. At approximately 1/3 into this narrative comes a deliberate pause to ask for engagement. If this reconstruction of Clara's experience strikes you, please comment with your city or country and a single word. If you want more documents and archive analysis, type archive. If you care more about the personal stories in human memory, type memory. Your response helps direct future episodes, especially where we pursue documentary leads in specific national collections or follow memories held by families. This story is complicated by sealed records and by the patchwork of private papers, and your comments help map where to look next. Now we return to the narrative to follow how local agitation, petitions, and the persistence of some witnesses slowly opened parts of the record. After the tribunal and the suppression, an investigative effort began led by a small group of local citizens and one obstinate clerk. Abigail Morgan and Reverend Boyd wrote petitions. A lawyer from a neighboring county named Elias Thorne took up the petition pro bono and drafted a memorandum that argued the custody order exceeded the authority of field clerks and demanded access to the registers. The memorandum quoted legal doctrines about property and dependent care and insisted on transparency. It was a formal text that used precise turns of phrase to make a claim about human dignity and legal limits. In response, the Office of Demobilization sent a terse reply that argued for the primacy of operational necessity, citing precedent and the language of confiscation as applied to supplies. The exchange between Thorne and the Demobilization Office is a study in rhetorical technique, one side appealing to law and precedent, the other to distributive necessity. Meanwhile, personal efforts persisted. Clara, with help from Lydia Price and a young clerk who had once been sympathetic named Daniel Pike, began to compile a dossier of their own. They collected receipts, letters, names of witnesses, and a copy of the register page that had been smudged but still legible in places. This grassroots archive made use of everyday objects and clandestine slips of paper, a practice historians later call paper rescue. In a scene that shows procedural detail, they met to stitch together an affidavit to submit to a tribunal. The procedure required them to list witnesses, to swear under oath, and to attach physical items. They used a local minister as an official witness to validate signatures. The affidavit included dates, times, and the peculiar smell of compressed hay on the night the ledger went missing as a sensory anchor. They submitted it and waited. The waiting period was marked by a low-level terror and hope. Clara developed a routine that mixed careful counting with small acts of defiance. She taught Eliza to sew a tiny mark into the hem of garments that would later prove provenance. She prayed in private and read aloud passages from the pocket Bible. The words felt like keys. Captain Mercer wrote to higher command in a way that folded his personal conflict into bureaucratic language. He asked whether a woman who had been recorded as a dependent could be returned under escort. His letters are formal, cautious, and occasionally reveal a tremor of conscience. He wrote, "There is distress that should be remedied," and sometimes added a line about his own inability to persuade a superior to act. Those letters were kept in a file stamped confidential. A second major tension occurs when a deputy appears to execute an order that would remove certain names from the register. In a 500 to 600 character passage, the scene shows Clara standing in a line at the office as the deputy calls names. He pauses on a name and then looks up at Captain Mercer. The pause is a small battlefield. Clara feels the blood rush at the back of her neck. A child fidgets. The deputy's hand rests on a ledger the way a judge's hand rests on a gavel. The moment elongates. Then a clerk draws a breath and says, "There is a supplemental authorization." The room releases in a whisper that feels like a broken string. Public pressure mounted. Abigail Morgan circulated stories. Local newspapers printed short paragraphs, and the rhetoric of scandal started to coalesce. At least one editorial questioned whether military operations should be allowed to subsume the lives of civilians and asked for the release of documents. A public letter appeared, signed by several neighbors, requesting a formal review by a tribunal. That public act forced the demobilization office to produce a partial release of records. Even then, many pages were redacted, blacked out with ink. Those redactions were visible traces of institutional choices about what to remember. The turning point came when a veteran clerk, now older and nearing retirement, leaked a copy of the original transfer list to Elias Thorne. The copy had smudges, but also initials that matched Captain Mercer's hand. That leakage created the possibility of legal action. Attorney Thorne filed a motion to compel production of records and called for a hearing that would examine the legality of custodial transfers. The hearing was technically a tribunal on procedure rather than a criminal indictment, but the public visibility transformed it. The tribunal convened in a courthouse that smelled of wax and long wood polish. Witnesses were called. Depositions were read. There is a procedural description of how that tribunal took written testimony, examined witnesses under cross-examination, and allowed an appeal. The panel produced an opinion that walked the line between operational necessity and legal norms. One of the dramatic moments of the tribunal was an emotional testimony by Clara herself. She spoke slowly, each sentence deliberate. She described the taste of bread, the creak of the bed, and the hush of night when she would pull out the locket. She recounted the day the ledger disappeared and the impression that a page had been taken out of her life. The panel listened. There is a section of the record that quotes her words, and it is this testimony that would later be cited by historians as emblematic of the human consequences of administrative action. Her voice registered the texture of loss and the fatigue of constant account-keeping. The hearing transcript shows 11 exchanges between Clara and the presiding officer, in which she describes facts and the officer probes legal standing. Those exchanges are precise, and they expose both the limits and the possibilities of a legal framework meant to bind conduct. The tribunal's decision was partial and ambiguous. It recognized procedural irregularities, but also deferred to the operational claims of the demobilization office. It ordered a review and mandated that certain dependents be re-examined, while leaving others in administrative custody pending appeal. The ruling used legal terms such as coverture and custodial designation, and indicated that appeals could be made through a formal channel. In practice, the ruling left many things unresolved. For Clara, this meant an incomplete victory. She had gained recognition that improper process occurred, but had not yet secured full restitution. An epilogue section will trace consequences at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. At 1 month, Clara had been returned to her home under conditional parole. The house was the same and different. Dust lay in the same places, but the ledger had been repaired and some pages replaced. She had the locket back, but noticed threadbare spots in the hem where someone had sewn a mark. Her sons were home, though one required medical care. The local community had rallied. Abigail Morgan organized a small fund to cover supplies. Captain Mercer had been reprimanded in a private memorandum, his name appearing in a file stamped sealed. The town felt watchful, as if its existence had been briefly measured against a bureaucratic scale. At 3 months, the social ripples were clearer. Clara had begun attending small meetings with other dependents to document losses. She had shared her little red notebook with Reverend Boyd, who read portions aloud to congregants and encouraged depositions to be notarized. A few more documents were released with redactions. The demobilization office issued a clarifying memorandum that narrowed the definition of dependents eligible for custodial transfer. That memorandum used language to close a loophole and was in the formal vocabulary of policymaking. People celebrated the rhetorical constraint as a victory. Yet the archive still contained sealed boxes. The town's newspaper printed a retrospective piece interrogating the use of administrative labels and questioning a system that allowed property language to touch human lives. At 6 months, the legal and social aftershocks continued. Captain Mercer had been moved to another post. He wrote one final letter to Clara in which he asked for forgiveness and acknowledged the limits of his courage. The file, stamped sealed, contained a note that he had recommended changes in clerical procedures. Some measures were implemented. Inventories were to require 2 independent clerks, and a publicly posted register was proposed for future demobilizations. Clara continued to catalog, to count, and to teach her children to mark their clothing. The community had changed its understanding of what paperwork could do. The archive had begun to be seen not simply as a repository of facts, but as a battlefield in which truth and silence were contested. In the longer term, Clara's persistence led to incremental changes in local administrative practices and to a broader conversation about how civilians are treated in transitions from war to peace. After the immediate aftermath, an investigation into suppression and redaction showed a pattern. Memoranda had been labeled sealed and withheld for decades. Some were reclassified after petitions by relatives. Donors who had kept original pocketbooks or letters in trunks sometimes added them to the national collection only, when assisted by local historians who vouched for their authenticity. Archivists like Miriam Cole described the process of recovery as detective work, in which a torn scrap could unlock a memory. The interplay between private papers and public records is critical to understanding why so many stories remained untold for so long. There are at least 4 moments of sustained moral interrogation in this narrative that demand attention. First, the use of confiscation language in administrative texts that did not explicitly intend to subsume people into property. The proximate question is how legal categories translate into treatment. Second, the role of clerks and low-level officers who make choices with outsized consequences. Third, the manner in which institutions use sealing and redaction not just to protect privacy, but to manage reputational risk. Fourth, the ways survivors use small acts of paper rescue to preserve memory. Each of these threads intersects in Clara's story and reveals institutional patterns that were not unique to one place. The official vocabulary that appears throughout the documents is revealing and must be cited.
Words like confiscation, tribunal, testimony, archive, sealed, memorandum, parole, demobilization, custodial, property, coverture, interrogation, deputy, and redaction appear repeatedly. They construct a framework in which administrative categories explain action and inaction. Yet between those words lie human stories that resist easy categorization. For reporters and historians, the task is to read both the language and its omissions, and to reconstruct what happened through cross-referencing depositions, letters, and small private archives. The aftermath of Clara's case carried consequences beyond her own life. Legal memos drafted in the months after the tribunal proposed clearer procedures for registering dependents and required independent oversight of inventories during demobilization. Military clerks were given new forms with a separate column explicitly for civilians to prevent forced categorization. Those changes are recorded in a memorandum of policy that reads dryly but enacted material differences. Local newspapers and ministers used Clara's story to advocate for increased oversight. Families elsewhere began to ask for similar reviews. In later decades, scholars would cite Clara's case as an early instance of how paperwork becomes policy. As historians reconstructed the record, they relied on multiple sources. The recovered evidence included Captain Mercer's pocketbook, a sealed memorandum labeled confidential, depositions by a long-deceased clerk, a torn page from a ledger smuggled by an anonymous neighbor, and the red notebook kept by Clara. The combination of public and private papers allowed a fuller picture to emerge. Academic articles would later explore how the concept of custodial transfer could be misapplied, and legal historians traced the rhetorical path from supply confiscation to human custody in procedural memos. The institutional strategy of suppression was methodical. Files were sealed, the chain of custody was blurred, and public explanations emphasized necessity. But the paper trail, even with blanks and redactions, kept evidence enough to reconstruct a narrative. There are procedural points of interest for those who study tribunals. Hearings were recorded in duplicate. Witnesses swore under penalty of
perjury. Panel decisions required majority vote and a statement of reasons. Appeals were permitted within a defined time frame. Requests to unseal documents required a motion showing public interest and were rarely entertained without political pressure. That technical architecture shaped the possibilities of redress and allowed delays that often functioned as denial. The tribunal's paperwork thus performed a double role. It could enable justice or sustain silence. In the years that followed, Clara kept a small archive. She pasted fragments of letters into a book and kept the locket in a box with a faded ribbon. She learned to rely on community memory. Abigail Morgan died before some of the files were released, but she had already told her children where to look. Daniel Pike moved to a neighboring county and later wrote a confession in which he said he had been pressured. That confession, which was first ignored, later became a linchpin when an archivist found it and used it to question earlier redactions. The slow accumulation of minor acts formed a cumulative argument. The moral of Clara's story cannot be reduced to a simple verdict. Bureaucracies can be instruments of order and of harm. Paperwork can record injustice or hide it. People like Clara remind us that records are not neutral. They are shaped by those who write them and by those who decide what to keep sealed. Her story shows how individual persistence interacts with institutional processes. It also shows how small acts of documentation can resist erasure. For historians, the task is to read both the visible text and the margins where human life is suggested. The conclusion of this narrative is both a summary and an invitation. Clara's experience after the surrender illuminates a pattern in which procedural language about confiscation and demobilization can be applied in ways that absorb civilian lives into military administration. Documents were sealed and redacted. Tribunals were convened with mixed results. Yet community memory and private papers eventually forced partial transparency. Records that were once classified became available, and scholars reconstructed a fuller account.
The cost to Clara was real and lasting. Her locket remained a symbol of a life measured against paper. The lesson for us now is that archives matter. They contain the traces of choices that shape lives and the tools to contest those choices. If this story moved you, please comment where you are watching from and type one word archive if you want more paperwork deep dives, or memory if you want more personal narratives. Your engagement helps guide which documents and communities we pursue next. If you want to see the sources we used, the collection references will be linked in the description, along with transcriptions of testimony and images of the artifacts when available. Subscribe for future episodes where we follow a particular file from a donor trunk to a national vault and examine the mechanics of sealing and release. Remember that history is not simply what is written, it is also the work of those who refuse to let pages remain blank.